Hello, these are the condensed Unit 3.5 notes, all about learning and also conditioning. So there are multiple types of learning. Conditioning, where we're training. Classical conditioning and operant conditioning are our two. With classical conditioning, we've got two stimuli that are repeatedly paired. One is an unconditioned stimulus or a natural instinct. The other is a neutral stimulus. And then with operant conditioning, we're working on learning through reinforcement and punishment. Another type is insight learning. This is when we have problem solving, where we just suddenly reorganize what we've already got in our brain to solve a problem. It's that aha moment, the I suddenly get it moment. That is insight learning. Wolfgang Kohler studied insight learning in chimps. He did the studies where they stacked the crates. They looked at the crates for a while, and then they figured out, oh, if I stack the crates, I can get up there and reach them. That was insight learning. Another type of learning, latent learning. The word latent means hidden. In this, it's where you have that subconscious retention of information, that you've just been collecting information by living out in the world, and then suddenly you're able to recall that information later when we need it. An example of this are cognitive maps. Tolman demonstrated this with his rats in the maze. The rats had time to explore the maze on their own, just like for fun. And then later on, he blocked off certain routes in the maze and gave them food as a reward at the end. And the ones who'd had time to explore the maze first did way better because they had formed a cognitive map and they had used latent learning to explore the maze. Let's see. Other examples of latent learning, knowing how to turn a steering wheel or drive a car just from watching others, knowing how to do CPR because you've seen it on TV shows, even though you might not have consciously tried to learn it. And then also knowing alternative routes to different places when there's traffic, again, because you've picked up on those things just from being out and about. Next type of learning is social learning, and that's where we learn by observation and imitating others. Albert Bandura showed this with the Bobo doll experiment. We learn by association, that we associate or link together two things, and that triggers a response. So again, classical and operant conditioning are types of association learning. Other things that we learn through association, taste aversions, when we associate food with a bad experience and then you don't want to eat it later, you're repulsed by it. That's classical conditioning. John Garcia said that we also are biologically predisposed to form certain taste aversions. Instinctive drift is the idea that if you try to teach a person or an animal to form an association that goes against their natural instincts, they will gradually drift back to what is their normal behavior. So a dog who's taught not to bark, like at a doorbell, will gradually revert back to barking at the doorbell because it's natural for him to bark at those loud sounds. Superstitions are another example of an association. We associate things that are seemingly random with an extreme outcome. And then another association example, we talked about this in multiple units, is the idea of learned helplessness. In the experiment, the dogs had the opportunity in one case to get away from shocks, so they did, but in the other case, dogs couldn't get away from shocks, so when they were moved to a situation where they could, they didn't even try. All right, part 2, all about classical conditioning, and our star of classical conditioning we know is Ivan Pavlov. You'll recall that we did a demonstration in class with the lemonade powder. Every time I said the name Pavlov, you put lemonade powder on your tongue, and then you may have developed a response later where anytime you heard me say Pavlov, you developed salivation. That was a classical conditioning response. So learning, just by definition, is a change in behavior from practice or experience, but experience, which is nurture, is the key. Classical conditioning is our learning that involves a neutral stimulus and a natural stimulus. So the reflexive stimulus is our unconditioned stimulus. Our response to that is the UCR, the unconditioned response. So for example, an unconditioned stimulus could be lemonade powder, and our unconditioned response to that would be salivating to the lemonade powder. Let's see. Again, unconditioned means that it's naturally learned or naturally existing. It's unlearned. Conditioned means that it's learned or has been taught. Let's see. So we can skip some of these. There was Pavlov's harness set that he used with his dog. We don't need to remember probably all the background information, but he was not actually intentionally studying salivation. He was studying digestion in the dogs. Skip. All right, so in Pavlov's classic example, the neutral stimulus was not exactly a bell, it was a tuning fork, but the dog had no response to that because the bell was neutral. When he brought out meat powder, the meat powder became an unconditioned stimulus, and the dog's unconditioned response to that was salivation. He paired together the tuning fork and the food. At first, there was no response, but then eventually the dog learned to salivate just from the tuning fork, and that's learned salivation is what we call our conditioned response. So unconditioned stimulus unconditionally or automatically triggers a response. That was the meat powder. The unconditioned response was the naturally occurring automatic response to the unconditioned stimulus. So salivating when the food was in the mouth. A conditioned stimulus is what was previously neutral, but it learns to trigger a conditioned response. So the tuning fork was neutral, but now it triggers a response. Then the conditioned response is our learned response to what was previously neutral. So salivating to the tuning fork alone. Let's see. So when the new behavior is learned, we call this acquisition. So when the dog first salivated to the tuning fork alone, that is called acquisition. Acquisition does also apply to operant conditioning, not just classical conditioning. Extinction, if we are no longer pairing together those stimuli, extinction occurs when the conditioned response goes away. Extinction, again, the behavior is gone. However, if it is fully extinct and then it comes back again after a rest period, we call that a spontaneous recovery. So the dog may not have heard the tuning fork for a while with the food, and then later on it randomly hears the tuning fork and starts salivating again. That's a spontaneous recovery. Again, there has to be a rest period with no response first before we can have a spontaneous recovery. Let's see. Part 3, a little bit more on classical conditioning. So when things that are similar to the original UCS are paired together with the conditioned stimulus, we can create stimulus generalization. So if the dog were to salivate to things that sounded similar to the tuning fork. Stimulus discrimination is where they learn to only respond to one thing. And you do that by only presenting the UCS, the other stimulus with the neutral stimulus. So discrimination, the ability to distinguish between a conditioned stimulus and other stimuli. So for example, if we taught the dog to salivate to a high-pitched tuning fork, but we did not teach him with a low-pitched tuning fork. Discrimination and generalization can also happen in operant conditioning. A couple examples of classical conditioning, also called Pavlovian conditioning. A passionate kiss combined would normally result in arousal. Onion breath would not. That would be very neutral and almost negative. But when that person is kissing with that onion breath, in theory, that onion breath could create the sexual response. A real-life example with cancer patients, the drug that the cancer patient takes may make them very nauseous. Sitting in a waiting room would be neutral, but when they take that drug, now they associate the waiting room with the drug, so then later on, just being in the waiting room causes them nausea. Higher order conditioning is where something that was neutral becomes a conditioned stimulus, and then now in a new pairing with something else, what was originally neutral can act like something that was unconditioned. So for example, children learn to pair McDonald's restaurants with food, and later they learn that the golden arches are a symbol for McDonald's, so now the golden arches alone causes salivation. Other examples of classical conditioning in daily life: prejudice, phobias, medical treatments, advertising, like associating songs and celebrities with products, and that makes you want to buy them. Behaviorism, we know, was studied by John B. Watson. He's considered the founder of behaviorism. He is known for the Little Albert experiment. We remember that he borrowed little Albert from a nearby orphanage, and he exposed Albert to various stimuli. So it was stimulus generalization, but basically he taught little Albert to to fear anything furry. Unethical because he was causing psychological harm to little Albert. So the neutral stimulus in that study was a white rat. Later on, it was other furry objects. The unconditioned stimulus was a loud banging sound. He'd hit that metal sounding bar right behind little Albert's head. So the unconditioned response was fear. Eventually, they paired those together, and little Albert exhibited fear of the white rat. Our next category is operant conditioning, part 4. So the big difference here is classical conditioning involved a reflexive response because we had that unconditioned stimulus mixed in there. Operant conditioning involves something that is voluntary, and the events follow a response, like consequences. Studying, for example, is not a reflex, but doing the studying can get the reward. Again, operant responses are voluntary. Let's see. E.L. Thorndike, such as a name that you do not have to recall, but the law of effect is something you should know, came around before the idea of operant conditioning. But Thorndike basically proved that desirable results in a study will cause a behavior to be repeated. He studied cats in puzzle boxes, and they were rewarded for finding their way out. So he proved that if you like the effect of something, you will repeat the behavior, law of effect. B.F. Skinner studied the same later, but he called it operant conditioning, proved that if you like the results of something, you do it again. He studied pigeons and rats in his operant chamber, also called the Skinner box, which was used to record exactly how many responses, like pressing the lever, they had to do in order to gain a reward or face a punishment. Some terms that Skinner included with operant conditioning: reinforcement and punishment. Remember, reinforcement is any procedure that increases the response. Punishment is anything that decreases the response. Some things that you could use as reinforcers were primary or secondary reinforcers. Primary are anything that satisfy a biological need, like food and water. Secondary are things that have learned value, like money or praise. We looked at this chart quite a bit in class. So remember that reinforcement, we are increasing a behavior. There's 2 types of reinforcement. Positive reinforcement, we're introducing something. Like cheerleaders are giving praise, that causes the team to score more points. Negative reinforcement, we're still increasing a behavior, but we're taking something away. So a negative fan is removed from the stands, and that helps the team score more points. Punishment decreases the overall behavior. Positive punishment, we're still decreasing the behavior, but we're giving them something. My boxes are off right here. But the child gets spanking, so we are giving them spankings, and that decreases their bad behavior, throwing tantrums. With negative punishment, we're still decreasing behavior, but we're doing it by taking something away. A child gets time out, we're taking out their free time to play, and that reduces the behavior of throwing tantrums. When it comes to reinforcement, research shows that an immediate reinforcer, so immediately giving them a reward or immediately punishing them, creates faster learning. Delayed gratification, it takes longer to build the response. Shaping is a type of operant conditioning where we can teach a new behavior by rewarding successive approximations. So as we get closer and closer to the behavior, we reward each small behavior, and then that we've taught a new behavior. If we're linking multiple behaviors, then we call that chaining. We watched the example of the rats playing basketball, and that was shaping and chaining. Part 5 are schedules of reinforcement. So again, reinforcement increases, punishment decreases, but when those happen, affect the learning. So if we reward or punish every single time, that's called a continuous schedule of reinforcement. Every single time you're late, you get a tardy. That would be a continuous schedule. Also applies to punishment. A partial schedule is when you don't reinforce every single time, only some of the time. So the continuous, you can learn a behavior very quickly, but the partial reinforced behaviors last longer because you don't know when that's going to happen, so you keep going just in case. We had different schedules for partial reinforcement, a ratio schedule. So we had fixed ratio schedules. Those are based on the number of responses. So every nth response is reinforced. So we said, for example, a car salesman gets a bonus every 5 cars. That's a fixed ratio. You lose your semester exam exemption after 4 absences. That's a fixed ratio schedule. A variable ratio schedule is when it varies unpredictably. So if you don't know how many times you have to sell a car in order to get a reward, if you don't know what days or how often the teacher is going to give the quiz, then that's a variable ratio. How often? Quiz is not a good one. I should have saved that for intervals. So intervals are based on time when the reward or punishment will happen. So if the salesman gets a paycheck every 2 weeks, that's a fixed interval. You take a quiz every Friday, that's a fixed interval. Variable interval is when you don't know when that reward or punishment is going to happen. Some more examples: a rat pressing the lever. Rat gets food for pressing the bar 5 times. That's a fixed ratio. If he gets it randomly, sometimes he presses it 5, 2, 6. That's a variable ratio. Works better because he's going to keep going because he doesn't know when the reward will come. Fixed interval: the rat gets food 30 seconds after pressing the bar. I think it's cut off, but if he got it random times after pressing the bar, that would be a variable interval. Again, resistance to extinction, the ratio ones, the variable ones are higher. Some side effects of punishment in general can cause to increased aggression, more passive aggressiveness, avoidance behaviors, learned helplessness. So in general, trying to use reinforcement is better. Key terms that go with classical and operant conditioning. Classical is sometimes called Pavlovian conditioning. We associate it with Pavlov and Watson. Unconditioned stimulus and response, conditioned stimulus and response. Terms like extinction, spontaneous recovery, generalization, discrimination, all go with both of them. In operant conditioning, we also call it the law of effect. Edward Thorndike, B.F. Skinner. This is the one with things like reinforcement and punishment and shaping, and it is voluntary. Again, when we're doing operant conditioning, the immediate feedback works best. Reinforcement and punishment need to be consistent. And then last part here, biofeedback is a type of operant conditioning relating to controlling biological functions in the body, like raising or lowering your heart rate. You use feedback from some kind of electronic device that lets you know like your heart rate is up, and then you practice things like deep breathing or relaxed thinking, and you could see your heart rate actively going down, would be a type of operant conditioning. The next part, 6, is social cognitive and observational learning. Refers to the idea that you can learn just by observing or watching models, and then also thinking about it and watching, so the cognitive part of it. We've already talked about some examples of social learning: insight, cognitive maps, latent learning. Scaffolding is the idea that you can build on what you've already learned before. So again, these are all part of behaviorism, and the behaviorist assumptions are that we focus on observable behavior. All behavior is learned. You start as a blank slate or tabula rasa, and everything comes after that. We started with classical conditioning with Pavlov, operant conditioning with Skinner, and then now we're here with observational learning with Bandura. So his social learning theory was demonstrated through the Bobo doll experiment. He said that acquisition is not just performance. Behavior can be learned in the absence of reinforcement, which means you can learn just by imitating others, even if you're not actually being rewarded or punishment. And that works especially with complex behaviors like language. So here's our Bobo doll study. Remember that children watched an aggressive model playing with Bobo, and then some watched a non-aggressive model. And then when they were given the opportunity to play with toys, they measured whether or not the children imitated the aggression or if they played calmly. And then the majority of the kids who saw the, the aggression repeated the aggression. So that concluded that aggression is a learned behavior, not an inbuilt instinct, and that without any reinforcement, kids are aggressive just through observing. Let's see. Let's skip some of these here. Applications of observational learning. So yes, kids learn from observing bad models, but the good news is that they also learn from pro-social, positive, helpful models. But anything where it talks about that they are learning through observation is social learning. A few other things here. Innate behaviors or instincts are the innate behaviors. Biological preparedness, the idea that we have a built-in readiness to form associations. And then we've talked about instinctive drift. When we condition responses that go against their natural instincts, they will gradually drift back toward their innate responses. All right, that's it for Unit 3.5.